guys, welcome back to this tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to cover exceptions. Now, what are these exceptions? Exceptions note errors and the other events which disrupt the normal flow of the code execution is called an exception. So, if you are executing a block of code and unexpected something happens, that's what an exception is. For example, if you are trying to, let's say, access an element of a error list, that element is not even available, that's what an exception occurs. So those are something which disrupt the normal flow of the code, and that is called an exception. Now, what happens when an exception occurs? So when an exception occurs, the execution of the code will halt, means it will stop immediately. If you are performing any DML operation, means you are adding some records to the database or you are updating some records, etc. So any DML operations which were processed before the exception, all those records will be rolled back and they will not be committed to the database. Anytime an exception occurs, it will also get logged in the debug logs. So somebody can take a look at it whenever they want, because every time an exception occurs will be logged in. Now, in case of unhandled exceptions, the unhandled exceptions are the exceptions that the code does not catch. Those are called as the unhandled exceptions. In those scenarios, Salesforce will send an email including the exception information to the end user. So the end user is going to see an error message in the Salesforce UI. So these are the things that happens whenever an exception occurs. Whenever we talk about exceptions, there are these three important statements that we need to take care of. One is called try statement, the other one we have is a catch statement, and the third one we have is a finally statement. In order to handle exception, so exception can occur, right? So you do not want to end the whole program, you still want to proceed. Let's say if one statement is resulting into an exception, you still want to deal with or finish the rest of the program. You just don't want to disrupt it and just don't want to hold the whole program. So how do you handle the exceptions? Now, in order to handle the exception, you can handle by using a try catch block. So what is a try block? So first thing is you have a try block, and inside of the try block you write all the code which you think might result into an exception. So exception is something may or may not happen. It is not something that will always happen. It may happen or it may not happen. But you need to write the code in a way that it should handle exceptions if it happens. So the try block is a block of code represent the code which might result into an exception. So and there are different kinds of exceptions, and we will talk about different kinds of exception in the upcoming tutorials. But whenever an exception occurs, there should be either a catch block to handle the exception, or there can be a finally block to handle the exception, or there can be both. Like you can have a catch block as well as a finally block to handle the exception. So anytime an exception occurs in the try block, it will be handled by the catch block. So catch block code will be get executed if the exception occurs. Now you can also have a finally block. Finally block is a block of code which will execute no matter what, if an exception occurs or if an exception doesn't occur. The catch block is a block of code which will only get executed if an exception occurs. So these are some of the points you need to remember. So what is the try block? A try block is a block of code in which an exception can occur. So you are going to write your code inside of a try block, the code which you think can result into an exception. The catch statement identifies a block of code that can handle a particular type of exception. So if a particular type of exception occurs and you have a catch block to handle that kind of exception, in that case, the catch block of code will be get executed. So if an exception occurs, a single try statement can have zero or more associated catch statements. And basically for one try block, you can have multiple catch statements handling different types of exception. And each catch statement must have a unique exception type. You cannot have two catch blocks of handling the same exception. You cannot have that. Also, once a particular exception type is caught in one catch block, the remaining catch blocks will not be executed. Now, the finally statement identifies a block of code which is guaranteed to execute, and it is basically used to clean up your code or release any resources, because finally block of code which will get executed no matter what, if the exception occurs or if it doesn't occur. A single try statement can have up to one associated finally statement. So you can have a try catch block, or you can have a try catch and finally block, or you can have a try and a finally block. Okay. Now, as I told you, finally block code will always get executed regardless of an exception was thrown or the what kind of exception was thrown. So it will always get executed. So since the finally block always execute, we usually use the final block in order to clean up the code or freeing up some resources. So these are some of the important points to remember regarding the try, catch, and the finally block. Now you can have a try, catch, and finally block together, or you can just have a try, catch block, or you can have a try, finally block. So what you are going to do here is whatever the code is you might think it might result in an exception, you are going to put that code in a inside of a try block. And then you have a particular catch block in order to handle the exception. So if this code result into two different exceptions, you will might have to catch blocks in order to handle those two different exceptions, or you can just have a generic catch block which handle all type of exception. So what kind of exceptions are and how to handle them, we are going to see those with the help of examples. This is just to give you an overview of what is an exception and how to handle them. Then you can have either a try block with the final. So you are going to write your code inside of the try block, and if an exception occurs or if an exception doesn't occur, the finally block of code will get executed. So you do not need to have a catch block with the try block. You can just have a finally block along with the try block. Okay. So both are syntactically or syntax wise, both these things are correct. These both. Now, this is a try, catch, finally block. So in this example, you can see here, you can have a try block, which basically will have the code that might cause an exception. Always remember the might word, okay? This particular block of code doesn't mean it will always result in exception. It might cause an exception, and then you have an exception catch exception block in order to handle that exception. It is basically a generic exception. Handling any kind of exception will be caught by this sketch block. And then you have a finally block, which is basically this code will execute it no matter what, and it is used to clean up your resources or clean up the code. So this is what we have is a try, catch, and finally block. Now this is just a quick overview of the exceptions. Now in the next tutorial, we are going ahead and do an example just showing you that what an exception is and what happens when an exception occurs. So I will see you in the next tutorial. Till then, have a good day. Bye.